Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Are you familiar with
Hmm.
Rahsaan Roland Kirk? Well, he would play three at once, and anyone who's ever seen him do that, it's pretty incredible to witness. So, I mean, very early on, and you if any sax players has two horns in the same room, will attempt this, circus trick essentially. Rahsaan turned it into a real musical exercise. And I know he had fabricated certain elements on his horn that allowed him to produce more notes with one hand than would be available in most cases. I only had my tenor and my baritone, so I was relegated to whatever sounds I could get just using the top notes on each. But Mark was very insistent on using that as a concept and wrote songs to feature that.
Hey, welcome to Feedback Def. I'm Sabby RK, the apostate music journalist, and I am excited to share this interview with you. I spoke to Dana Colley in September of 2023. Colley is, of course, best known as the saxophone player in the alt-era trio Morphine. Now, there was nothing on the musical landscape quite like Morphine when the Boston trio first formed in the late 80s. And of all the iconic saxophone players in the annals of rock and pop, no one has ever carved out a place for the instrument quite like Colley. It's not like Morphine invented the idea of presenting jazz influences in a way that was palatable to younger, hipper audiences, but they pulled it off with a breathtaking sense of style and freshness. Morphine's two most immediately distinguishing features, in fact, were Colley's rich baritone/tenor sax harmonies, and of course, late frontman bandleader Mark Sandman's two-string slide bass. Inspired by the Spartan directness of blues artists like Muddy Waters, Sandman's blueprint was anchored more in dynamic build-up than chord changes. When he heard Willie Joe Duncan's unitar performance on Bob Froggy Lander's 1956 single The Cherokee Dance, a light bulb went off. And when Morphine started to make waves at the onset of the alternative zeitgeist, Colley's baritone was like the rocket fuel that powered Sandman's vision. Last September, which would be 2023, the label Light in the Attic reissued the band's final two albums, 1997's Like Swimming and their swan song, The Night, which was released in February of 2000, 7 months after Sandman collapsed on stage and died in the middle of a Morphine performance in Palestrina, Italy. I remember when that news surfaced. I actually remember where I was. I was sitting at a computer online at the downtown public library in the city I live in. So this is one of my all-time favorite bands. There are certain bands that are so meaningful to me that they rise above even the status of music. If like the sound of crickets on a summer night, or the way the air feels on a crisp autumn afternoon, or like a cat sitting on your lap when you're wrapped in a nice fuzzy blanket, or something like that. I was going to include the sound of my daughter's breathing, but that's even one notch higher. If those are some of the things you cherish the most about living, there's certain music that I would say gets to that level of those kinds of things. And Morphine certainly does for me. Mark Sandman had this presence, or at least projected a presence, that I found very reassuring. But when the news broke that he had died, it was also announced right then and there that the master tapes for The Night had just been delivered 2 weeks prior. Now, in this interview with Colley, he seems to contradict that very slightly, like saying that the record was almost finished but not quite. In any case, the news was cushioned by this sense of, well, that's really sad, but at least we're getting this one last finished statement from this artist. There's this sense of completion that I feel in my gut, even though the person's life and work has been cut short. It's like, well, they got one in under the wire, So that's how I felt at the time. Now, The Night is very distinct from the rest of the band's work. For one, it has a much more mournful vibe overall, and that's not just what we might read into it, given the circumstances. Also, as you'll hear in this interview, the band went way further than ever before in bringing in outside instrumentation and using the studio as an instrument. So what I was reading off the top there was like a hybrid of two different things I wrote. A little blurb about Morphine's sophomore record, Cure for Pain, for a roundup for Paste magazine of like our favorite albums of 1993. And then I wrote a longer piece for PopMatters, which has highlights from this interview you're about to hear. So here's a little more from my PopMatters piece. So I'm talking about The Night here. Even on down-tempo numbers such as Rope on Fire and Like a Mirror, Sandman's mixes teem with activity. Instead of the band rhythmically propelling the music as it had done in the past, the songs on The Night undulate with movement. Often the sounds play on the ear like the musical equivalent of neon-colored schools of fish twirling in unison in the pitch-black depths of the ocean. Or I might even say, like a glowing coral reef at the bottom of the ocean. Not necessarily pitch black, but certainly darker, kind of enveloped by this lack of light, is how I would describe it. A rather solemn listening experience compared to the rest of the catalog, The Night unfolds slowly in what can only be described as a gorgeously somber mood. I wouldn't say can only be described, but maybe best be described. But the album's soul reveals itself most, perhaps, on the song Souvenir, an especially downcast, dirge-like chronicle of regret that begins with the now iconic line, "I remember meeting you, we were super low." My fellow PopMatters contributor Brian Stout, an avid fan of The Night, he was like sharing his perspective because I wanted to pick his brain on being as much of a fan, and I wanted to sort of sprinkle some of where he was coming from into the piece, or at least into the spirit of the piece. Stout suggests that the current pop culture landscape is ripe for the band to find favor once again, even if just in niche pockets. I think that's a really astute observation. Still, as more time passes, it's hard for me not to mourn for the moment in time that Morphine's music will always be remembered for, especially having lived through that moment. For me, Souvenir epitomizes that feeling that I get of an era coming to a close. So I wrote this. For once, Sandman's bass, though certainly prominent, doesn't play the central role. Instead, lower register piano chords darken the skies with a profound sense of woe. About 2/3 of the way through the song, Colley enters the picture for the first time to play a saxophone solo. Supremely fluid and lyrical as always, Colley's lines fill the otherwise heavily overcast soundscape with streaks of golden light. Looking back, his solo functions as a brilliant sunset for a band, a decade, and an already fading sense of promise around independent music. Now that's totally arbitrary, right? I'm not saying that song is like has to be in the framing that I put it in, but there's something about that moment that to me feels like the sunset on the 90s, like the song and that solo for me feels like a requiem for the 90s. And that's not exactly how it actually happens. You know what I mean? It's not like one day or one performance closes a chapter in music history, but these are the sensations that these things evoke. I hope you enjoy this interview with Dana. The one thing that really stands out is that he has what I consider to be an unfortunately modest sense of what his impact was. Yes, Sandman was the central visionary, but you don't have that band without him, without just his style is so, there's so much body to it and spirit and heft. Man, some of his lines are just so memorable. And, I even go so far as to say, right up there with like Clarence Clemens and, he's up there. In fact, he's my number one. So that's just my take. All right. And without further ado, I give you Dana Colley.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Sorry, I'm a little late.
That's totally fine. Oh, okay. I mean, I could do video if you want.
Yeah.
All right.
Howdy.
So I have a bunch of questions. So we got 45 minutes, and I'll probably have more than what we can cram into that. So I'll just start with the obvious. Besides speaking with Ryan in 2021 and doing interviews for the liner notes on these new reissues, What was your involvement in the way these two albums were repackaged, or how much, if any, input did you have?
Well, to be honest, I kind of led our mastering engineer, Pete Weiss, into the vaults, and we kind of combed through what looked to be the raw materials, and he collected what he thought would be. Sorry, just trying to eliminate.
It's okay. You're going to see my eyes track over to my questions. So
yeah, no, I'm trying to eliminate some of the sounds that are popping up in the mail on. Okay. So I basically we just went to the vaults. We have this storage facility where we have essentially all of the Morphine tapes and marks, effects, papers, and and Sabine, his girlfriend, Sabine Hishtakian, and Deb Klein have been working diligently just to kind of comb through that stuff in terms of the archives. And so in that process, they've kind of organized a lot of what was in there. And Pete Weiss and I went in and just sort of pulled tapes that seemed to, correspond to what might work with this release. And not to mention just obviously the masters of the record itself, but whatever might be interesting in terms of additional tracks. But it was Pete who really did the hard work. He listened, he selected and formulated the playlist before anything else happened. And then once that was collected and we got that sort of sequenced, he was responsible for mastering it and getting it ready for vinyl. So I don't know if you know Pete Weiss, but he's an amazing engineer and producer.
Sure.
Player.
So, okay, it sounds like you did then have to listen to this new, the playlists Pete put together, because I wondered how much, I know you've been performing a lot of this material for years, since 99. But I wondered how much you had sat and listened to either of these records in all that time prior to this.
A lot.
Okay.
No, I don't tend to have a tendency to go back and listen to Morphine records. It's, honestly, just from the minute that they're released, you've spent so much time focusing on them and, getting them mixed and getting them mastered and working on them, that once they're done, it's like, there's no point really going back and listening to it from my perspective, although I did listen to these just to see how, it kind of flowed and that sort of thing. And, it's not that enjoyable of an experience for me to go back in there and comb through that stuff. I get kind of bogged down quite easily, so the process is a bit tedious. So I'm happy that we had someone like Pete who was willing to jump in there.
Right. A mastering engineer's ears are built for tedium.
Exactly. Yeah.
They can listen to something over and over and over for all these nuances and take this like 30,000 foot view that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I get way too in the weeds in terms of what I, hear. And I mean, some of it's valuable. We'd have some back and forth in terms of like, okay, that song was called that, or this song was a prototype of something else, and that sort of thing, So it was kind of a lot of, dialogue back and forth, but it was pretty much into Pete's hands.
Yeah. I mean, I could see why something like this would not fall on someone who was in a band from everything that you just described, having participated in the making and the gestation of an album.
Right.
A band member's ears are not built to.
Well, you moved on, and you're in many ways, and it's like a painter who, would walk into the gallery and with a paintbrush and go up to his own painting and then go up and tweak a little bit of the color. You're never really finished. You know, you kind of have to let it go at some point.
Right.
So you know, you probably never let it go entirely. So
And so, okay, so when you were listening to, and particularly for how the new additional bonus material flowed with the whole, I'm just curious what kinds of feelings it stirred up from these two very distinct records, distinct from one another, and also together distinct from the previous three records.
well, you know, it's I have to say that I have to say, moving forward a little bit, getting the test pressings back was a revelation in many ways. Just to hear the night on vinyl in headphones was really very gratifying. You know, these recordings came out on CDs essentially initially, and that's sort of gone by the wayside. So I haven't had a really, if I wanted to, I probably wouldn't have put on, you know, a CD in the last few years. So never mind a Morphine CD. So I've always have loved vinyl. So to be able to take what was, you know, the night and hear it in that format, I was very impressed and surprised, and it kind of felt like it had sort of come home a little bit. You know, the recording felt as if, okay, this is how it should be heard. This, especially the night where you have a lot of instrumentation, a lot of you know, additional instrumentation and layers and stuff, and something about hearing it in vinyl just it really seemed to work well with the recording. It just seemed warmer, it seemed deeper, it seemed you know, just omnipotent, or, you know, just omni sound. It was just full. And I think the CDs were fine, but something about the transferring it to vinyl. I mean, once again, Pete did an amazing job. And so as a listening experience, I think the vinyl has really improved the experience for both these records. You know, just in terms of orally, you know.
Sure. There's
answer your question. Sorry.
That's okay. That's totally fine. I'll press on that a little bit, but I'm glad you said that, because like Swimming is very rich in terms of the sense of space. Those are probably some of the most the richest reverbs like I've ever come across, right? And I mean, it's just like this thick pouring out of your speaker. Something, it's so thick and spacious. And then the night is, there's so much detail.
Yeah,
and so much mood.
Yeah. It's funny because Mark really loved reverb, and he used it lavishly on the saxophones, especially, and the vocals and that sort of thing. And he enjoyed the effects of his outboard gear, and he had a couple that he relied on heavily. But he was not afraid to use little reverb for sure. The night, especially, I mean, like you say, like Swimming, you know, is wet, you know, so that's probably why.
Yeah. I mean, it seems really obvious, right? And I always wondered, okay, so there's the cover, right? You see the cover I saw the album cover before I heard the music, and I'm like, okay, is that, but it's not. It's like, even if it had just been blank, a white, if it had come in a paper bag without the picture or the underwater photo or the title, I mean, like I said, those reverbs are very sumptuous on that record. And then the night is moody, so it would seem that vinyl would support both the ambience of both of those records, and also the headphone aspects,
Yeah.
especially now.
Yeah. No, yeah. It's I mean, the interesting thing about vinyl is that it just seems, I don't know, deeper somehow, just not as flat across the board. And you can really kind of hear the layers almost as if they were blown out in terms of like a 3D image in a way,
Totally, totally. And it's amazing to me how much people dispute that, like from a technical perspective. And it's like, God, just sit.
Yeah.
It's like being in a room versus looking at a screen of a room.
Yeah, absolutely. Being in the room is exactly what it is like, and that's the beauty of vinyl, that you get the air in the room. I find that to be true in most cases with records, that you hear the room as much as you hear the music, and in a lot of different recordings, that's what makes it interesting, because there's so many different ambiences that were captured, and especially early days of recording, you have that's what they relied on in terms of getting reverb or getting a sound. It was the room that they were looking for, and we had the night was recorded mostly high and dry, and so you'll hear that room as well as the added effects. And like Swimming, some things were done on 4-track, 8-track cassette tapes. Some things were transferred up to 2-inch tape and taken in the studios, kind of cobbled together a little bit. But the night was done in one particular room, which was Mark's loft space at Cambridge. And you hear that it's like kind of part of the instrumentation.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I did not realize from 1997 until yesterday that Like Swimming was like you said, cobbled together, because it is it's sort of shaped into one cohesive sound. Whoever I looked at it, I think it was Greg Colby who mastered it originally. I could be wrong about that, but I was just looking at the credits a little while ago. But it doesn't feel cobbled together at all. And I just thought, as compared to like Yes, right, which that album kind of is a little bit switching lanes as you go through it. Like, to me, Like Swimming felt very steady. So however that was done, I was impressed to find.
It's interesting. I mean, Like Swimming wasn't very popular when it came out. It was kind of a letdown for us. So it's interesting to hear how people respond to it now. Anyway.
So both of these records, according to the liner notes, and I didn't go too deep into them, but normally I would like inhale all that information. But it seemed like, well, let me not let those dictate what I'm going to talk to you about so much. But from the liner notes and from the documentary, it seems like both of those records had somewhat of a difficult birth for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what your perspective was throughout, in terms of, obviously there's the jump to DreamWorks, which changes the dynamic significantly, or at least that's the way it's been told afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, well, I guess the move to DreamWorks kind of put things into a different league for us. Like Swimming came out on Ryko Disc, and then we signed the deal with DreamWorks, and then I think DreamWorks and Ryko Disc together combined to somehow jointly release Like Swimming. I kind of forget. I'm a little foggy on how that all worked out. But I don't think anybody was really fully invested in that record, because we had already. I think they were looking for the next one, which would have been The Night, which then DreamWorks would have complete control over. So I think they were much more interested in and what they would have more control over, more ownership over than what had already previously come out. And it was not an easy time for the band. Mark was feeling a lot of pressure to, hit one out of the park, so to speak. DreamWorks had a lot of, they were expecting, something big from us. And, we, we went and made one record, and with Paul Coldery and Sean Slade, essentially made one complete record. And that ended up being scrapped, and we ended up not working with Paul and Sean, and went back into Mark's studio and started again. And it was pretty, it was a kind of a tumultuous time for the band. Mark was looking at other avenues, he had a lot of people in his ear for the first time. He was trying to satisfy a record label and an A&R man, and wasn't having an easy time with that. He wasn't used to getting, having to please anybody but himself. So that was, it was an added stress. He was looking at a lot of different angles to see what would be the magic bullet, starting with the drums. He and Billy had worked together for years, and Mark was really starting to question whether or not, Billy was up for the task, in his opinion, if he was going to be able to pull off the drum parts in the way in which Mark was wanting to hear it in his head, which caused a lot of rift between us, and we all kind of felt like our job, in terms of Billy and I, we weren't sure if we were going to be in the band, one day to the next. There was talk of using, Beck's horn section and pairing him with the Dust Brothers, and LA Hollywood got in there and wanted to kind of take Mark and turn him into the next Beck, and that didn't necessarily mean that we were expendable, which was pretty much clear in terms of how they saw the project. Ultimately, in the end, Sandman stuck to what he had. He danced with the girl he came with, to the dance. He came back to the band. He came back to me and Billy, and invited Jerome to come in, and the combination of Billy and Jerome playing drums really laid the groundwork for some amazing drum tracks, that were on the night. And that seemed to be the solution. And once we were finished mixing, and Mark was happy, I think, for the first time in many years. He felt satisfied that we had accomplished making a great record. And then, like, it was literally within that month, we were off on the road and looking at a European tour, and it was 99, and our second performance in Palestrina, Italy, is where Mark passed away on stage. And so at that point, the record didn't really go anywhere. It was me and Billy. We had to finish it. We had to take it. We had to go home and take the mixes and master them and sequence them and do the artwork and put this out, and then follow it up with a live representation with the orchestra Morphine. And it wasn't DreamWorks really weren't interested in what we were doing, and they made it pretty clear that they weren't going to support orchestra Morphine. And to be honest, I'm not even sure how much they supported the release of the night. And DreamWorks Music didn't last much longer after that either. I think they kind of folded soon after. So I think we certainly didn't live up to with their expectations. We didn't live long enough to live up to their expectations. But so the record kind of just went out, and those people who knew the band, some of them couldn't even listen to it because it was so difficult, so painful to think about, and Mark's prophetic, lyrics off, many were reading between the lines and seeing potential, his sort of maybe writing on the wall that, our, life is limited and precious, and you could read a lot into what the lyrics and a lot of the mood of the night. It somehow seems almost as if it was, a prophecy in some weird way. So anyway, that was the story of the night, and like swimming kind of just sort of came out, and I'm not even sure what happened. It kind of came out, and it wasn't, people weren't getting too excited about it at the time. It was like, oh yeah, they sound like themselves. They sound, there's another record that sounds like Morphine. Well, yeah, that's kind of what we do.
Well, not everybody felt that way. uh, but so it's interesting because this is a band that was somehow managed. So everything you described, right? There's so much interference and outside dynamics coming into potentially and almost come really close to and started to corrupt the creative integrity or structure of the band.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it didn't succeed in undermining the vision in the end. Oddly, that record doesn't sound compromised at all.
No, well, it wasn't, because in the end, Mark said, "Screw everybody! I'm going to go back to the studio and do it myself, and I'm going to produce it, and I'm going to use Dana, and I'm going to use Mike Rivard, and I'm going to use my people, and I'm going to do it my way." And it wasn't like it was a breeze at that point, but still very searching, and there was something Mark was going for that seemed elusive throughout the process, but somehow we at the end of the day it hung together, and stepping back was like, okay, this is good. We can sign off on this.
Yeah, and it doesn't. So from the film, it sounds like the documentary. It sounds like there was outside, like you described, label A&R, Hollywood, all that stuff. It sounds like he was genuinely tempted, though, to dance with the devil.
Yeah, I mean, there was money on the line. They invested in the band, and they invested in him, and they wanted a return on their investment. And he had a very personal relationship with Lenny Warnaker, and who was like kind of a mentor, and he wanted to obviously fulfill the agreement and the bargain that they had made, in delivering a record that he would be happy with. Not only Mark would be happy, but the label would be happy with. He was, and but I think he was being pulled in different directions, but ultimately, stuck to what he knew and what he believed in. And to credit to Mark, who at the end of the day, after a lot of that, it would be very easy to be tempted to go and say, yeah, I'll go to LA and do this myself with Beck's horn section, have a hit record and everybody's happy. But he wanted to maintain control in the environment that he was comfortable in, with players that he knew and players he could rely on, and not feel as if he was being pushed through some sort of I don't know, just the system.
Mm-hmm. So then after, well, this I remember reading the news online that Mark had passed away on stage, and or he collapsed on stage. And the understanding I had was that the record had already been turned in at that point. And so the news came as like well, this person has passed away, but there's this new record that's in the pipeline coming and pretty much done. So that, can you correct that if that's...
I don't believe it wasn't necessarily turned in, but it was certain. I think it was in the pipeline for sure. We had mixed it, we had finished it, mixed it, but it hadn't been sequenced or mastered. We didn't have a name for the record. It wasn't until Mark passed away that all of that happened with Billy Conway and myself. So, I mean, we just basically had to finish the artwork, come up with the artwork, finish the artwork, do the credits, and master it. So it was, but it was done in all for most, intents and purposes.
See, and you mentioned how some people, it sounds like you're talking about fans. Some fans had a difficult time, or they were reading, obviously, it colors what you hear. Even if somebody doesn't die, if a band breaks up, people start hearing things. You just can't help it, right? And some of that actually might even be there. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily not there, but I do think that record has a lot of different colors, though.
Mm.
It's not something that, like, it's tempting to describe it as maybe more ruminating, or maybe a little darker, or maybe a little more somber or heavier emotionally, but there's a lot more. Like, you kind of have to digest what the mood is. There's a lot of different things, I think, going on there. What's when you hear that album in terms of the dimension it has, what do you hear?
Oh, I just kind of hear that the beauty of what, the Morphine sound was, people often asked us, do you ever think about using a guitar? And it was like, yeah, we do it. The thing about what's great is that, as a trio, if we laid down a basic track with the three of us and that worked, then that was fine. But it also, there was, you could bring in other instruments on almost anything and layer them in. And pretty much every song that we've recorded has some other elements to it beyond what you'd see us playing on stage. And so I think we always treated recording as a different animal, and live performance versus recording. And why not use the the magic of being in a studio to get a sound you want, whether or not you can accomplish that exact same thing live or not, didn't really seem to matter. There was two versions. We have a stripped down version that we do live, and then on record we could add what we wanted to it. And you'll hear guitar on a lot of tracks. You'll hear a lot of like distortion, keyboards, little bits and pieces here and there that of different sounds that are added, and multiple different horns, other horn players. Russ Gershon has come in, different bass players, like I said, Mike Bard. And we had string sections in the night with, piano, all sorts. So there was room for other instruments if it seemed to propel the song. Why not use them? Why not, take advantage of what you can do in the studio? So when I listen to that, I hear kind of I hear like the fruition of of being in that environment where you're reaching for something. You're looking how to shape this idea you have, and you have the basis, the foundation, but then you have the kind of the magic and the additives that you bring into it that can kind of just spread it out a little bit and give your ears a little bit more retreat here and there. It's different if you're hearing it occasionally as opposed to as a main instrument. So like guitars and pianos and all of that stuff, as it comes in, just seem to really kind of work well with the basic foundation of what the trio would bring. But in a live setting, it was also refreshing just to kind of like, just rely on the three of us to get that idea, that song across. So there was like two different worlds we've always sort of played with, and we never really wanted to limit ourselves in the studio. Once again, yeah. I'm not sure I answered your question.
I don't even remember at this point. That's fine. That's good. That's a good thing. Yeah, it's like the full realization of what had always, because all along, as you mentioned, there had always been other instruments. They were just blended in a much more subtle way.
Yeah. Well, you hear Spider Me, that's Jimmy Ryan on mandolin and Mark on his Gibson guitar, and Mickey Bones, I think, on drums, and so that there was always that in there. Mark's Tritar and Murder for the Money, there, or John Medeski playing organ on the night. There's a lot of different moments, little features of different instruments or different players that really worked well, but wasn't it really necessary to be in terms of getting the song across live, you know?
Right. And I've never checked the credits for this, but going as far back as Do Not Go Quietly, it sounds like there's like one of those preset organ rhythms. I don't even know if it's actually there. I don't know if that's Jerome just simulating that effect. But there was always little ear candy, but like I said, it was much more subtle. And on the night, it kind of blossoms. Like, okay, here it is. This is sort of the world of sound that this band can still be a vehicle for.
Yeah, and it's did we ever have the only time I think we ever had like a guest play with us, I think was maybe when Medeski Martin and Wood opened up for us, and John would join us occasionally. But other than that, I don't think we ever. Okay, I was just listening to Do Not Go Quietly just to see if there was anything in there other than. So you got sax, you got shaker and drum, you got your bass. That's pretty much your standard Morphine basic track. And that's it. So I don't think there's anything in on this one necessarily other than those three instruments. Pretty sure he didn't use anything else. But what we also, it comes to think of, is like we're always interested in sort of the implication of other instrumentation, like the idea that you're hearing something maybe that's there that isn't, but your head picks up on it. Like Mark would always say, why don't you use any guitar on your? He said, well, we have implied guitar, it's not there, but we imply it.
Sure. And, that question was beaten to death. And I actually recently wrote up Cure for Pain for Paste Magazine, had a best, like they had us all pick albums or vote on albums we love from 1993. And so I got assigned to do that one and didn't mention the guitar. I'm not mentioning it in this piece either. I think that whole framing was just a reflection of people's limitations just because of what else was around, so, but and also there was implied. That's pretty funny. Mark would say implied guitar. There was also actual guitar at times, just not featured as you mentioned. So it sounds like the morale in the band was, or specifically for you and Billy, was in a difficult place. How were you feeling, aside from the obvious, right? Aside from the Mark's passing away, once the record started to take shape, though, okay were you feeling about where things could go from there, as far as you guys staying intact?
Well, that's a good question. I think I distinctly remember sitting at Mark's studio at the desk where we're listening to the mixes that we had, which essentially the completion of the record. And when it was over, for the first time in a long time, I saw Mark smile. And it was a smile of satisfaction, smile of like, yep, we did it. This is it. We finally, brought this one home. And it was arduous, the whole process. I mean, really was. And to see, and just that shift, it was like, okay, we did it. When we did it on our terms, we did it with our people, and we stayed together, and we figured out how to do this without burning bridges. Well, we may have burned a couple, but in terms of our band, we stayed intact and became more unified as a result of the whole process somehow, because what mattered to us was the music. And someone like Billy Conway, who was the ultimate team player, really suffered the most humiliation and degradation and just, brutally pummeled with, by Mark and his Mark wanting more and more and more from him. And Billy could have quit on a number of occasions, and instead of quitting, just kept coming back and said, okay, well, what can I do? How can I make this better? What, and continually came back to the project when most people would have just said, fuck you, I'm done. And to his credit, he stuck with it, and that loyalty to the sound and to the music was more important than any of our own, connection to it or participation. Even if the song sound better without me, then the song should not have me playing on it. That's simple, and that's what was important to us. So by the time we had come away from all of this and realized that we had made a good record and that we were happy with, that we could be proud of, it was a great sense of relief. It was a great sense of promise, and going out onto the road for the first time. We brought Jerome with us when we did a little, Eastern Seaboard jaunt, and Jerome and Billy played together. The first time we had 4 people, it was Morphine, and it was like a huge relief, and looked like, we're on to something else, and that we're going to start a whole new chapter as a band. We're playing, we could play wherever we wanted to. For we touring the world, we could select what shows we wanted to do, where we wanted to play, and it was a great way to make a living and to be in a band. And we had kind of crossed into that another phase as a band, and it looked promising, from my perspective. And looking back, I see a lot of our contemporary bands that continued and made, kind of crossed over into the next level, and sort of became, institutions. And I think we could have potentially joined them in that regard. Mark was never a Grateful Dead fan, and I can't say I was a big fan either, but the thing I really enjoyed and loved and appreciated was that they had this thing that they held on to and nurtured, and as a band they could go and do their separate things and have their lives, but coming back to this one thing that they did together, that they preserved for all these years, that they could come together and do and create and enjoy. That to me was always a great model. It's something if you want to do a solo project, go do your solo project. You want to go play with those guys, go play with those guys. But we have this thing that we can always do together, and it doesn't have to. You don't have to compromise other, ambitions to maintain and to keep the band alive. And we were brothers, we're family, and it was our life, and it was looking pretty good from that point. Especially having coming out of that tumultuous period and having survived it, things were looking up.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because the band had a really healthy touring demand from basically 93 onwards. You're talking about the pressure from record companies to try to get a hit, but I feel like somehow once Morphine sort of resonated with, in 93 with Cure for Pain, sort of struck a collective nerve somehow, sort of on that fringe of like independent music, like that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it never really let up from there.
No, it didn't, and it was quite a ride, and we were touring 9 months of the year, for the most part, all around the world. We'd go across the country, then we'd go from California to, Hawaii to Japan to Australia, New Zealand, and then Europe, and then come home and rest for a little while, and then go back and do it again. And it was we were always moving, always moving. But that was our bread and butter, and that's kind of where, you know, when you're in that situation, you have to kind of it's like a shark. You got to keep swimming. You can't stop. You have to, if there's opportunities, you have to follow them. You have to continue. You just have to keep the momentum going. So it was hard to say no. It's hard not to be out there, so, because you just don't know how long it's going to last. So you just keep going with it.
Yeah, but it seems to me like the label maybe didn't quite, like maybe record, just speaking more generally, using Morphine as an example, maybe labels would have been better to say, look, we don't need to try to turn everything into a hit. Why don't we just try to sort of max optimize where a band is at and where a band is already excelling?
Yeah.
And where a band is already striking a chord. Because it like, I don't know.
It would have been interesting to see, because it's hard to know what would have happened. Obviously, DreamWorks was a new record label. I don't think they had a lot of experience working with bands at that point. They were starting off and kind of getting their feet in the water. They signed us. I think they signed the Eels and somebody else, and they honestly didn't have a lot of experience. And at that point, we didn't have a lot of interaction with working with a label, and vice versa. So we were pretty happy and content just to do what we did on our terms without having to satisfy anyone else. So that relationship hadn't really even been tested in terms of what that would have been like had we continued. So it's hard to know.
But yeah, they also signed the Rollins band too.
Oh, did they? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and just before it wasn't. I think they put out interesting records and somehow managed to not fuck up people's people's thing. But I think, I certainly couldn't speak for everybody I think there are certain, if a band has not had a radio hit for its whole career, I think in some ways for the listeners, that's a badge of honor, because there's no song that gets plucked out of the whole body of work that gets undue attention or an imbalance of attention that doesn't feel like it's now the possession of the masses.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of a snooty, like it's not so much that you want a band to be just yours, but it's like, it doesn't become like McDonald's.
Right. I know. I hear exactly what you're saying. Yeah, no question about it. I mean, it becomes ubiquitous in the culture to the point of just, it no longer represents anything, because it's just become wallpaper, or just constantly, you're always hearing the song. You're always, you don't really associate it necessarily with anything other than, oh, this is the song that's on the radio. And then the next hit comes on, and that's one that comes on the radio, and it just it kind of depersonalizes the whole relationship between the music and the makers.
Totally. And it's such a strange thing, because it's meant to be powerful, right? It's meant to like resonate on a mass. And there's so many examples of records that have sold a ton that are just amazing, right? But it's also meant to numb you to its own impact. Like, I never quite understood that.
Yeah. Well, you get hurt, you hear it, enough times, and it just, you just stop really hearing it that way. It just becomes something that's recognizable. And that is what's maybe that's the appeal. I don't know. Oh, I recognize this. Oh, that song, I know this song. And, obviously that has some great appeal for the masses. And that's, for a record company, that's, in the record business, that's what people are trying to do. That's what their goal is. They want to sell those songs. And, if you try to write a hit, it's not, you're probably not going to succeed unless you're, Smokey Robinson or somebody like that, who that's really what that's what they do. That's what they're looking to do. And that really wasn't where we were coming from. We weren't in the hit factory trying to hammer out, one after the other. It wasn't really what we were about.
Right. Even, oh,
yeah.
sorry.
No, I
No,
was just going
please,
to say,
please.
we just want to make our own music, and if we like it, and someone else wants to hear it, then great, you know.
I feel like, I mean, so even people like in the Brill Building or Tin Pan Alley or all those people, they struck out a ton.
Of course, yeah, yeah.
In proportion to the hits. You know, I feel like if anybody who's an artist, a musician, wants to create a body of work, other than again the obvious halt in your career progression, I think they could only dream of having a career like that, where it never did get taken away from the band, the music. I wanted to ask.
They might enjoy the financial ramifications of putting their kids through college, but other than that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disparage that at all, but I wonder, I wonder at what price. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing if you get there, but I wonder at what cost would that come to. You know, I guess I wouldn't know, but I think Morphine, especially we're talking about the night. It's like you look at that body of work, and then all the B-sides and all the rarities and everything, and it's like this never got tainted. You can as a listener, you can exist with those songs and find your own way through it completely unencumbered by this sort of mass perception, other than maybe that Cure for Pain is sort of, I would think, considered sort of the quintessential album. If I'm trying to put my antenna out there, I think that's because it's like where the band kind of arrived. It's kind of how you made your stamp, right?
Yep, no question.
But other than that, it's like it's totally open to somebody without all this extra baggage. And I think that's from listeners, regardless of whose kids did not get put through college.
Not yet, anyway. We're still working on it.
Right. You talked about Billy. I wanted to ask you, the late Billy Conway, you were in a really unique situation because all the way back from Treat Her Right, Billy and Jerome were coming in and out throughout the timeline. Can you talk about what each of them brought that was unique? You talked about them coming together on the on the night, and also I remember when the band did that run with both of them on stage. I remember that being in the news. What did each of them bring that was distinct? How did they each? Because I always looked at it as it was like this extended family. They're both part of it. It seems like it was difficult, though, at times for both of them. But in terms of musical style and approach, how would you?
Yeah, I mean, well, Jerome, for one, is just one of the most gifted musicians I've ever played with. He's just an exceptional drummer in all ways. And when the thing about Cure for Pain is that when we got together with Jerome, formed the band, did some touring, did some recording. It's all, Billy and Jerome have always been close, and as they were always good friends, they always would play together and go to each other's houses and set up drums and play and stuff like that. And it always been like good close friends and collaborators. And in the early day when Jerome was playing, he was having issues with his like tendonitis and issues with his just kind of physical being that was really keeping him from just not playing without pain. And it just he was going through some stuff physically, and just right about the same time that Morphine was starting to take off and we were getting busier and busier, and Jerome had decided that he wanted to leave the band, and Mark just sort of asked him, well, if before you do that, we just come back from playing, I think out in California. He said, well, just before you do that, why don't we go in and record the songs we've been playing on the road just to get them down before you go. And so we went into Fort Apache, and they spent a day getting drum sounds with Paul Coldery, And we went in and kind of went through the list of songs, and Jerome was so good that in his mind, he thought he was still just getting drum sounds. But in fact, he was laying down the takes because Paul was always recording. So Jerome was like, okay, well, that was a good warm up. Let's do it now. And then Paul's like, well, we got it, And Jerome was so good that he didn't even realize that what he had done was as good as it needed to be. And so those drum tracks on Cure for Pain are like almost first takes, where him just little first or second takes, just laying it down, because he was always spot on. So and then he's very, very precise, very, just an exceptional musician. And Billy has a whole different, well, I wouldn't say whole different, but he has a kind of a unique personal approach to the drums that is his own, and an attitude that is just someone you just want to be around, So the combination of what Billy brought to the band really kind of picked up right where Jerome left off, and he's such an easy guy to be around, and it's such a joy to be around. That traveling the world, it was just a breeze and real pleasure, honestly, just to be in his company at any given time. Anybody who's ever talked to who's known Billy will tell you the same thing. You were never in a conversation with him or where you didn't feel as if you had his entire complete attention. Like there was no one else in the world, and he made you feel like there was no one else in the world but you when you were talking to him. And so, I mean, his demeanor, his mannerism, his just a unique, one of a kind individual, one of the smartest guys I've ever known, a philosopher, just incredibly well read, and just had the perfect temperament to be on the road. Never flustered, never panicked, never never needy, just going with it and making the most of it and delivering every time. And he's just one of the greatest guys and greatest friends there is. And his playing, of course, is there's not too many drummers that you can say have their own unique approach and sound. And Billy certainly had his, and it was a lot different than Jerome's. It was a different style, and maybe a little bit more open in terms of his style and his positioning and how he played. And for what we did, I think it really propelled the band forward. It's been a live setting. He was a monster, and so cathartic to watch. I mean, you could see him playing and just sweating and smiling and grunting and groaning, and you just could not help but you couldn't take your eyes off him. He was just so dynamic.
I was going to say, I listened to Bootleg Detroit last night, and I never realized. So what's the name of that song? Mary, Won't You Call My Name, I think is the second track on there. And I didn't realize how driving his foot was.
Yeah. Well, he had a calf like the size of a coconut, it was like this big. And he was a hockey player. Like he was a captain of his Yale hockey team and would have gone to the Olympics and would have played on the that team that Rosioni was on, the whatever on ice, what was that team that won the Olympics?
Beat the Russians. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. He was supposed to be on that team, but he was laid up in the hospital with a knee injury. But so, I mean, he had huge, powerful legs. So when he came down on that kick drum, you could feel it. But he also had such a subtle touch too. He had a really great, amazing, dynamics, really,
Right. And his snare, that like subtle articulation.
Yeah.
Just those little.
Yeah. The ghost notes.
Yes. Thank you. And those like, all of that, all those, subtle phrases could be so big,
Yeah.
and yet so well, not simple, but just he could do so much
Direct.
with just
Yeah.
yes, he could do so much with like small.
Yeah. Well, he was a lot about the spaces in between, the air in between. So, I mean, you think we're playing drums in 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, right? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, now the and is the space between. And that it has as much meaning and as much significance as the actual, note itself. And Billy was a master of that space and holding on to that space and giving that space as much importance as the actual sound of the drum itself.
And how lucky of a band that you and Mark had these two players in your orbit who were almost like, I don't know if it's too strong to say musical soulmates, but there's something about the way both of them, just even the story, they knew each other, like you said, they were friends.
Yeah.
And their styles both could be housed and actually define what the band's sound like. Their styles like defined Morphine both equally in a strange kind of beautiful way.
Yeah. I honestly have a hard time telling who's playing what when I hear a record, and sometimes I'll think, oh, that was Jerome. I say, no, that was Billy. I mean, I had a hard time, if I close my eyes, knowing who's who. But and when they play together, you couldn't tell who's playing what, and they couldn't tell you who's playing what. When you listen to Tracks of the Night, they were playing together, and I think in some cases they can't, to this day, they're not sure who's playing what.
And again, it's an example on the night. I'm glad you brought that up, because there are times when you're actually hearing two drummers work as one, and you have to really, and they're like, oh, someone's playing this like cymbal pattern here, and someone else is playing this very basic. But again, there's a lot to hang around those parts. They could really play as sort of one mind in a way that I think is
well, yeah. They I mean, that's a product of their friendship and their camaraderie. Billy would pull back to allow for Jerome. You could see him just sort of like in maybe just hit one little thing over here and letting Jerome take the lead on a song, and then they'd switch over and Billy would take the drum throne and Jerome would play more percussive parts, and leaving space for each other, letting each other take the wheel when it made most sense to them. They knew what each one were capable of and who would be best for doing what.
And hopefully with the re-release of that album, people can pay attention to that and to discover that, like, aspiring drummers or whoever, just that's what two people can two percussions.
It could even birth the next octopus drummer who doesn't realize there are two drummers and thinks that one person is doing it, and then learns all of those parts. It's like Guy Van Dusen, a guitar player who was studying a song by Chet Atkins or something like that, and he had learned all the bass part with his thumb and had learned this song and had got all the parts down because he was convinced that it was one track, and it turns out that there were overdubs in the end, that Chet Atkins had overdubbed the parts, but he didn't know that. So he just thought, that's somebody, he had to have been able to play this, so I have to be able to play this, and actually learned it that way. So yeah,
that's pretty awesome. You mentioned how Billy was to travel with. What was Mark like to be around to travel with? I mean, I know that it's been well documented. You guys have said, and others have said, he wasn't the easiest person to get to know as far as being open about his life and his background. Ryan's liner notes open with the photo shoot for like swimming at his parents, and you and Billy are taken aback that he's even allowing you into that part of his life, right? But what was it like to be in his company in that kind of, going around traveling?
Well, I think Mark loved the tour, and he loved being on stage and doing what he loved to do. And I think this is sort of we were experiencing success, like none of us had ever experienced in a project. It was snowballing. So for the most part, it was pretty enjoyable. What's not to like. We're playing sold out shows. We're getting paid well. We're staying in good hotels. We're going to cities that we love, and sometimes staying, a couple days in places we liked. We could pay our rents, and didn't have to paint houses anymore. So there was a lot of greatness and appreciation of what we were experiencing. But Mark definitely had a vision. He had just unrelenting ambition, which was always about what the next thing was going to be, where we're going to go, what we're going to do, what we'd record, and just always on the go. Mark was a unique individual. He had it's hard to know what was going on with him all the time. Just sort of, for Billy and I, we played sports, so we knew what it was like to be on a team, and have a role and be a team player, and knew when to keep our mouth shut, and knew when to go along, and knew when to speak up and say, hey, you know what, that's not cool, or maybe we should try something different. But for the most part, we're there to kind of facilitate and make things go as smoothly as possible. And Mark could be demanding in many ways. Mark was the kind of guy who, if you came into a hotel and there was a line at the check-in, like let's say 10 people back, I would if I was me, I would sit there with my suitcase and get in line and wait. Mark would go past the line, go right up to the desk, and clear his throat, and have 3 people, working on whatever it was he needed done. He demanded a certain amount of, commanded a certain amount of attention. He had that kind of charisma and way about him. And we were talking last night. We were at a show here in Cambridge, Somerville, and a friend of mine who was the original Treat Her Right roadie. His name is Paul Richards. We're talking about, Mark, how Mark was about your food, how you'd get something come to you, and he'd look at it and he'd say, no, you're not going to eat that. Send it back. He'd look at your plate and say, no, that's not good. No, we're going to send that back. And you'd be looking at, no, it's fine. I'm hungry, Mark. This is great. He goes, no, you're going to send that back. That's not good. It's like, he would order for you. He'd say, you're going to have the chicken and the half baked chicken and the the mashed potatoes and veg. And you think, okay, yeah, that's what I'll have. And and he was talking about, to Paul, Paul was putting, okay, you're gonna like this. Paul was putting French fries on his he was putting pepper on his French fries. And Paul was telling me this last night, because he had a hamburger and he had French fries, and he was putting pepper on his French fries. Mm-hmm. He said, you remember how Mark was with food? He looked at me once when I was putting pepper, and he goes, what are you doing? And I said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Do you think that's where the song came from? He goes, I guess so. I can't, unless you know another story. Because it was around that time. So it would have been, it certainly would. So Mark took what Paul was doing. And to be honest, Paul doesn't just put pepper on his French fries. He took the top off the damn pepper shaker and then sprinkled it onto his pepper. So he liked a lot of pepper on his French fries. So I could see how that would catch anybody's eyebrow. But Mark, of course, took that instance and made a song out of it. So, he was quirky. He he had his, but he was also incredibly generous, and, he'd loyal to his friends, and, you'd go to his house and would be playing or something, and he'd disappear, and all of a sudden he'd come back with a plate of food. You know, he was in the kitchen just cooking up something. You know, he's always feeding us or taking care of us or giving us instruments, or you know, he was, and he had a lot of friends that loved him and who he loved a lot, and he was the hub of our universe here in Boston. You know, the musical universe. But you know, everybody has their different personality quirks, and Mark certainly had his.
Yeah, I wonder whether he wouldn't have gone on to maybe not necessarily be A&R, but nurture other.
Yeah, he did. He did. He had bands that he produced and that he loved. And I don't know if you heard of the band Mr. Airplane Man. Margaret and Tara, two women who played guitar, kind of almost like from the school of trying to think, not R.L. Burnside, but that sort of kind of that sort of sound, this house rocking sound, and oh God, I can't think of the name of the one person that they were really modeled themselves after. Anyway, Mark took them under his wing and brought them into the studio and recorded them. And in Ray Corvair, he was really into this other local band in Boston, that he would find these guys and find bands that he loved and definitely nurture them and give them opportunities to record and that sort of thing. So maybe he would have branched into that.
Or something like that, not necessarily A&R for a label, but some way of nurturing or incubating other people's and supporting other people's the sort of music ecosystem wherever he would have been, you know.
Well, he did. He did that. He's very much a part of that, and that was really, he did that for a lot of us, and certainly did that for me, you know. So,
well, and I mean, you know, not that the song Every Night Around 11 o'clock is necessarily to be taken literally, but one does get the sense hearing that, even though it's kind of a playful it's a playful lyric, one does get the sense that he did like being out and about. I remember
it was literal.
Okay.
Yeah, there was rarely a night that he did not go out at 11 o'clock. So yeah, he would always, and he'd wind up at the Middle East, you know, about 11 o'clock and hang out with Joseph and Nabil and at his table, and Peter Wolf and various people who would come through, and, you know, he'd have a pint of Bass and some, you know, hang out and see what was happening. It was always fun to go out with Mark, because he had a way of, like, he never paid for, you know, he didn't have to pay to go into anywhere. They just say, oh yeah, come on in. And if I was tagging along, you go, oh, it's my sax player. I go, oh yeah, come on in. I always felt like I was an important person hanging out with Mark, for sure.
That's pretty funny. One of the quotes that's most memorable, actually one of the most memorable quotes I've ever heard, is Mark describing himself. He said, "I'm a loner, but I'm a sociable loner."
I hadn't heard that one. That fits. Sounds good.
So you started playing with Mark. You started playing with Mark while Treat Her Right was still active. Obviously, you were brought along as a guitar tech.
Yeah.
That's in quotes, right? Kind of.
It's in as many quotations as you can type. Yes.
Okay. But that was, my understanding is that was just kind of a lark. Like, he had a bunch of other things going as well, and the tape you guys did at his loft was not really meant to be like a focus at all. It was just like, oh, this thing you guys did almost as a one-off. Okay, let's play a couple shows with Jerome, and that'll be that. What was your, right before that happened, like up to that point, what were you thinking your life was going to be?
Well, you know, I'm in my mid-20s, painting houses for a living, playing music at night, and really with no plan, and no, like, people talk about 5-year plans and stuff, and I was like, what the hell is that? I have no idea. Pretty much just living in the moment, living from day to day, you know, hand to mouth. And any opportunity to play music was basically, my existence was designed to allow for the flexibility that it takes to be a musician, so to be able to paint houses gave me flexibility. If I had to go away, if I was, had a tour or something like that, I could, I could go and I still have work when I came back, that sort of thing. And that was it. That was pretty much, I didn't really think about, down the road, or, certainly didn't think that any musical, project was going to have any success. It just didn't seem like that was obtainable. I know a lot of people in the music world at the time seemed to look for ways to be the next thing, or to be successful, or find a way to make this thing, pay out. And I always felt that as soon as you did that, you're lost. You lost a real reason for doing it. For us, it was about making the music and finding a way to express what you had going on inside. And that was like a fire in your belly that you just had to find a way to put this out there. And the fact that anyone cared or listened was surprising in many ways. So, at that age, I didn't really think about what my future was going to be. I was too busy being in the present.
Well, and I mean, yeah, I mean, it's clear that this was almost like a happy accident for you.
Certainly. I mean, yeah, we got lucky for sure. A lot of things. I often think about, we talked about CDs. Ironically, I think that really can be responsible for what got us over that hump. When Ryko ended up signing us, that was just the beginning of the advent of the CD, and Ryko at that point was a company that was collecting catalogs and reissuing that on CD. Was this new medium that sounded phenomenal, and everybody wanted to hear what their old records sounded like on this new forum. So all the Hannibal catalog and the Caroline catalog they bought up and reissued on CD, and it was like this appetite for anything on CD. And well, Cure for Pain came out on CD, and just slipped right into that kind of pipeline where, okay, we'll take that. That's on CD, great, let's listen to that. And thankfully, because the way that was recorded, like the way Paul Coldery recorded that, it just comes out of the speakers in this pristine, full sound that was new. It was really new. That the medium was new, the technology was new, the oral experience was new, and so we were very fortunate to have kind of fallen right into that, and which made there was an appetite for hearing music in a really kind of a unique time. And we were, I think we definitely benefited from that enormously. So timing and luck and a lot of things kind of played in our favor for sure. We could have easily have just, been another bar band, of a side project of Treater Rights, and that would have been the end of it.
Yeah, and as much as there's this, what I consider to be an oversimplification of the quote unquote alternative era, like, because Cure for Pain comes out smack in that, there was also this, just from a listener standpoint, a fan of music, there was this incredible sense of freedom and possibility, because you were seeing like indie labels and like independent subsidiaries of major labels, and major labels all sort of taking some chances. There's the cynical side, or there's the post Nirvana gold rush kind of thing that's real, right? But there was also a lot of interesting underground stuff bubbling up right at the margins and sort of breaking through in a really cool way. And I just remember feeling like, man, there's so much. We're supposedly in this like alternative rock era, but there's also so much going on that is exploratory, and I think that partially explains why the band was able to reach people.
No, true. I think, yeah, no, and it was a period of time where the culture was really kind of open to the underground in a way that was unique, I think, and alternative, became mainstream, and very quickly, and gave a lot of people a lot of great opportunities, like the obscure groups of, bar bands from all over were now, being listened to and taken seriously and given opportunities that 10 years previously probably wouldn't have happened because it wasn't as polished or, ready for prime time or what have you. Yeah, I like the idea of that gold rush idea, and it's very much. I think we were definitely within that, in that kind of push west, the manifest destiny.
Yeah, and but I also think people were, it's, because we can talk. It's like we can talk about how corporate mass culture homogenizes everything. I mean, we touched on this a little while ago, but it's like I also think there are good things. We got to remember that, like, Jimi Hendrix was on a record label. You know what I'm saying? Like, there have been great things that have come from that whole
Yeah.
system. No, but it sounds to me like you saw Treat Her Right kind of having not the best experience at trying to go for it, right? Like, it sounds and I wonder what your impression was at the time, because you talked about, you had friends and you knew of bands that were trying to make it. Treat Her Right went through that, and it seems like it was somewhat disillusioning.
Yeah. Well, there was unfortunately a cautionary tale with Treat Her Right in terms of what not to do, and it's they went through it and saved us from having to go through it. I mean, the idea of signing to a major, well, almost anyway, they signed to a major record label and, getting caught up in all of that, all of these guys, the RCA people who had ideas for the band. Let's do this tour where, okay, they travel across country on a train and they play in all these different towns on a train. It'll be very cool. But okay, we need to get them somewhere else in the middle of this tour. Okay, so let's put them on a plane. Okay, but then we got to get the gear somewhere. Okay, let's put the gear on a bus. So, like, at one point they had, a train, tickets to trains that they weren't on. They were flying on a plane to somewhere, and their gear was traveling on a bus. I mean, you can imagine the just bleeding money. And the record company was just coming up with, these cockamamie ideas to spend their money, basically. And we learned that, to take an advance from a record company, you have to understand that that's all has to be recouped before you see a dime. And they learned a lesson the hard way, because they allowed these ideas to be, and they allowed other people to kind of, influence what might have been just a band decision, and because they were working with a company and they wanted to be team players, but they were naive and young, and they didn't understand that, that it was their money that these guys were spending. And a lot of these guys, are quite happy to do that, because they jump on a project and they milk it, and then they go to the next one. They don't have an investment in you as a person, or you as your life, or your livelihood, or your career. They're not interested in that. They're interested in their own careers and moving from one thing to another. And you're just a piece in the puzzle. And I think that was pretty painful for Mark and painful for the band, Treat Her Right, and Mark was pretty determined not to let that happen again, that we would try to retain as much control as we could. And, we didn't take an advance from Ryko, and we recouped. And so, trying to keep your expenses low and your overhead low, and economically trying to do things in a way that made sense, and so that you had something in your pocket at the end of the day. Once again, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, you totally are. You totally are. Because I mean, I think that Morphine was able to work with a major and not end up selling their soul.
It was close. It was close. I mean, the DreamWorks came in sort of at the that was at the twilight period of the band, and their involvement, as we mentioned and talked about earlier, was enough to put a fissure in the whole thing. They certainly succeeded in sowing doubt enough, once they getting involved in something that we had never had to make those kind of concessions with anyone. And it left a scar for sure, but fortunately we had already achieved a certain amount of autonomy before that had happened. So I think we could see what was happening a little clearer than maybe if we had been younger, and this was the only opportunity we had ever had, and we would do whatever it took and whatever they asked of us.
Mm-hmm. Let me go back real quick to that moment where Steve Berlin says to Mark, "Oh, this is great. Like, who's that playing horn on this?" And he goes, "Oh, actually, that's him. That's Dana right over there. You mean that kid right over there?" He's like, "Yeah." And then you meet Steve Berlin, and he has a big impact on how you.
Yeah. No, Steve is just one of the best, one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever met, and just so humble and down to earth. All those guys in Los Lobos are so really about, lifting up, anyone in all, boats, and so to speak, and giving people an opportunity and startup. People are just starting off. They're very kind in that way, and if you just go see their show, they're always bringing some kid up on stage to play who's like, is just getting started. They give opportunities to a lot of where they see people who are, they appreciate, they reach out and lift up, and Steve was like that. He was amazing. I mean, it was one of those things where my friend Paul, who I was mentioning, who the Pepper, he was the Treaterite guitar tech, and he was going on to work in film, so he's bequeathed the job to me. And for me, it was they were going out on the road to open up for Los Lobos. Treaterite was opening up for Los Lobos during the neighborhood tour, and I was a huge fan of Steve's. Growing up in high school, being a sax player, and loving rock music, there was rarely an example of the saxophone being used, except for like as a solo instrument, like Baker Street, or Down by the River, or Turn the Page, that kind of stuff. It was like, okay, here's the saxophone solo. Okay, get out. Where Steve was involved in the whole bed of the music, and it was like he was in there, and for me it was like a beacon of light. It's like, okay, wow, the saxophone can do that, can be involved in a rock band, and not just play a solo and then sit there and play tambourine for the rest of the gig. So for me to actually, I heard him on record before I knew who he was, and so knowing who he was, and then having this opportunity to go out on the road, it was, for me, it was in Morphine. We had recorded a demo, which was good, and we had it on cassette. Yeah. And so knowing I was going to be on the road with my heroes, but knowing that I was there to be a guitar tech, not to play the saxophone, I kind of cagely brought my saxophone mouthpiece with me, and just in case, but for whatever reason, maybe I get to play with Steve, and he loans me his horn. What if? I'll just pack my mouthpiece. It's like, you carry your own toothbrush. You wouldn't loan it. So the mouthpiece is, you could play someone else's horn as long as you had your own mouthpiece. So, I didn't think much of it. And then, Mark came back and said, "Oh yeah, Steve really liked the tape, and he suggested that you should come up and play, with the band and play with Treat Her Right." And I told him you didn't have your horn with him. You didn't have your horn with you. And he said, "Why don't you come backstage? You can play his." And I almost dropped right there. I said, "Well," so I went back, saw him. He was in his dressing room. He was getting his horns ready, and, "Hey, Steve, Mark mentioned that you'd be cool if I sat in using your horn." He goes, "Oh yeah, come on in, come in. Here's my horn. I know you'll treat it like it's your own, and I've got a couple of mouthpieces you can try if you want." At this point, I was like, "I hope you don't think I'm too presumptuous here, but I brought my own mouthpiece just in case this was going to happen." I felt kind of sheepish for sure. And of course, he was like, "Oh, great, no problem. Yeah, of course, use your own piece here." Like he didn't think anything of it. Of course, I was like, "God, I can't believe I'm being this bold here." It's not usually my way of going through things, but he was incredibly generous. He showed me, what he was doing. He was soaking his reeds. He did this method of shaping and carving reeds, and I still do it today. It's like a method of like just taking wood off the sides and fabricating your reed so that it vibrates better and sounds better and has more consistency throughout. And he took time and just kind of really showed me his whole setup and stuff, and it was life-changing for me musically. I can hear pre-Berlin meeting and post-Berlin meeting in terms of my own playing. And we stay in touch today. If he's in town, he reaches out and invites me to do whatever he's doing, and he's just one of the greatest guys and a really good friend. And I'm so blessed that I got that opportunity.
Right, because it was unbeknownst to you that Mark even let him hear the tape, right?
Well, I may have mentioned that he gave it to him, to hear. I'm sure he may have mentioned it, but it was when he had listened to it the night before, came back and said, "Who's the Barry player?" So that kid rolling up guitar chords, because I was not a very good guitar tech. So I think the band eventually figured out it was safer to have me on stage playing saxophone than it was tuning their guitars.
That's really funny. That's really funny. Yeah, I mean, I love how what's so extraordinary about his playing is his horns, his repertoire of different horns are like other characters in the song. Like they get to sort of inhabit the songs as much as David Hidalgo's vocals do.
Mm-hmm.
This beautiful way, like it's like watching. Like the lyrics are one thing, but then there's this other collective presence of these horns sort of playing off that.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Right. It was like it was a beacon for me, for sure. It's like, okay, it can be done. They're doing it. And,
sorry.
Just the idea of like the saxophone being an integral part of a rock lineup, and not just playing a solo, but playing what a guitar would do in some cases, sometimes playing what a bass would do, and just being a part of that bed was something I was always really trying to do. I mean, I'm a frustrated guitar player essentially. I wanted to be in a guitar band, but no one paid me to play guitar. But I could play the saxophone, so.
So you actually wanted to play guitar in a guitar band, is what you're saying.
You can see this.
I see that.
I love the guitar. I love any instrument other than the saxophone. To be honest, is intriguing because it's the idea that you can just you can hit a note, right, and you just press it and it comes out. Wow, you don't need a reed. You don't need a mouthpiece. You don't need to get everything working. You don't need to have this tube, sealing perfectly, and it doesn't need to be warmed up. You can just bam, hit it, and it makes a sound. Is like, okay, wow, that's nice to have like, to get a saxophone to work. It takes at least an hour just to warm up before you start to play before you start to play yourself and it's like the saxophone isn't playing you, you're playing, it kind of thing.
How much did
And
you
that,
have
yeah,
to? Oh, go ahead.
no, that's all.
No, no, please, please, please.
I lost my train there.
Sorry, sorry. I thought you were. I thought you were. No, that's what I hate about Zoom. But how much did you have to uh concern yourself with staying in shape for breathing when you're playing in a band, sweaty clubs?
Yeah, well, back in
Shape.
those days, there were smoky, sweaty clubs, so
Mm-hmm.
and everybody smoked. It's I try to, I've always been athletic to a certain degree. I like to skate, skateboard, bicycle, play basketball. So I've always tried to kind of stay healthy in that regard. But there was a period there in the 90s where everything was smoky. Every club was smoky. Airplanes were smoky. Restaurants were smoking. My bandmates smoked. They smoked backstage, and to the point where you get to the place where in my 30s where I was like, you know what? I am so inundated with everyone else's smoke. Let me have one of those things. I'll try one myself. I'd rather have my own smoke here than having to breathe everybody else's. And I jumped in, and I was a smoker for, I don't know, not too long, a couple of years maybe. And in your 30s, you feel invincible. You don't feel like any of this is going to ever touch you. So I mean, it's and you look back, all the horn players in the 30s and 40s are all smoking and playing at the same time. It's a lot of times it's like, playing a saxophone after a while becomes just like, singing or speaking. It just comes out of you, whether or not you're at your tip top lung capacity or not, you're going to be able to play it. It's going to come out. I've quit smoking cigarettes at this point in my life, and thankfully, and I will never go back. It's a horrible habit, and certainly doesn't help playing. But generally speaking, I'll be 62 in October, so I try to maintain a certain level of fitness and looking after myself so that I can play, and now that I'm getting older, it's quite conceivable that, there'll be a day when I'm not going to be able to do it. I look at Sonny Rollins and I know he's come to a place in his life. He's in his 80s, who's, it's a long run, but you get to a place in your life where you can't do the thing that brought you through, and I'd like to be able to do it as long as I can, I guess. So try to maintain.
So when Morphine started, I just want to make sure I'm clear. You were still thinking that if you were going to do music, it was going to be in a guitar. You were going to be in a guitar capacity.
Well, I mean, guitar is metaphor. I knew I wasn't going to play guitar. It wasn't something that anyone's going to hire me to do, and it certainly didn't. Me playing guitar isn't going to sound unique in any way. So the only shot I had was the saxophone. Really, it was the only voice I had. Truly, that was something that was my own. So, but in using in that capacity of playing saxophone in the role of what the guitar would do in a trio, essentially.
Where did you get the idea to? And I'm sure you've answered this before, but I want to get it from the horse's mouth. To do the Barry and tenor.
Yeah, Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Are you familiar with Rahsaan Roland Kirk? Well, he would play three at once, and anyone who's ever seen him do that, it's pretty incredible to witness. So, I mean, very early on, and if any sax player has two horns in the same room, will attempt this, circus trick. Essentially, Rahsaan turned it into a real musical exercise. And I know he had fabricated certain elements on his horn that allowed him to produce more notes with one hand than would be, available in most cases. I only had my tenor and my baritone, so I was relegated to whatever sounds I could get just using the top notes on each. But Mark was very insistent on using that as a concept, and wrote songs to feature that. Mm-hmm. So Super Sex, Radar, Wishing Well, we kind of were written around the concept of what we can get out of these notes here. You know, what key is that? Where can that work? And you know, I always considered it as kind of a novelty, you know, in many ways, and not really a musical. It's like, you know, okay, you know, it's like playing or having two straws in a glass of water. You know, it's not that hard. You just blow. You know, it's not hard, and your brain just it's like it's all coming from the same place. So you have this immediate kind of tightness between the two sounds, right? Like two horn players couldn't ever really know when they're going to play exactly at the same time, but in this method you can. So it creates this simultaneous tightness of the sound, because it's all generating from the same impulse, which makes it, you know, unique in itself, I guess.
Right. You probably wouldn't have even been able to double your parts with as much precision,
right,
as when you were doing that, right? You know, I would push back on that, because you're describing it almost like it's like a trick shot in basketball or something, or a trick play, or a trick play.
Globetrotters of saxophone, yeah.
See, I would have to push back on that, because But
the thing is, people go to see the Harlem Globetrotters.
That's true. That's true. Or you're making it sound like it's a trick play in football or something. Like,
yeah, it's the old Statue of Liberty. It's the flea flicker. It's the
right. The Philly, right?
Yeah.
Which probably, I don't know how much that hurts you being from Massachusetts, but the
not at all. Not
okay. I'd push back on that. I wouldn't describe it as that. I thought that those harmonies were very tastefully done and very musical, and I could see where Mark would have been like, well, okay, I'm playing these, yes, I'm inspired to strip the bass down, but I'm playing these kind of fifths on or a slide with even one string, sometimes expanding the saxophone harmony slots in with that in a way that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not that different than like using a harmonizer pedal, but it sounds more organic, and there's more thickness and a texture.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it has its sound for sure, and not to diminish it entirely, but it's I guess it's very limited, and can, in that way, as a player, you realize what the limitations are. And, you know, which is great. We always try to work with our limitations. I think that's kind of certainly been part of our ethos, is to limit, you know, and to strip down and to work within limitations. So, I mean, in that, you know, double sax has enormous limitations. You only have a few notes really you can work with, and a couple that are harmonizing, and, you know, so you have to kind of work with what you have. And that was interesting, I think, from, you know, and obviously as a audience member, it creates an element of awe, because anyone who doesn't play the saxophone thinks, oh my God, the guy's playing two saxophones at once. But if they only realize it's you know, it's very easy to do it, and it's really simple. But it has a very unique and powerful sound, and as a performative element, it's effective.
It's kind of like when you see these like 70s era arena rock bands with like a double neck guitar, and one of them was a 12-string kind of a thing, where it just looks
yeah. Or you take or the Spinal Tap, where he takes the violin and uses it as a bow against the guitar. It's similar kind of concept, you know. Sure.
So, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, you mostly did not do independent lines with your fingers. It was you were mostly doubling like ba 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 da 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 ba 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 da 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 ba da da,
Well, it
right like that.
depends. I mean, the independent lines would vary if if there could be a harmony, or depending upon what's happening with the riff, you'd either. Yeah, it was hard to say. I mean, there was some. I mean, how independent could it be? It's all basically happening at the same time, but it's yeah, I don't know. It's like this. Sometimes they were unison, sometimes they were completely mirrored, and other times they would I'd hold on one note and move another one down just to kind of get it kind of like a you know a movement through the note. Um, I just try to play with whatever I could find and just try to remember it, hopefully, for the next time.
Okay, and looking through the credits over the years, having I you did not get to like do any much guitar, any of those little guitar things. It didn't seem like that was coming from you on those Morphine records. Like how
No,
much?
mostly Mark. The only guitar I've ever done was as a thing called "Come in Houston."
Okay, which is like a rarities.
It's a video that we made from Super 8 film that I had shot when we were in Japan and France, and edited to a track that Billy and I played and Mark played trombone on. So Billy's on drums, I'm playing a classical guitar, just doing this little riff, and then Mark came in with a trombone. He played trombone in school and was actually pretty good at it. That's the only time I've played guitar on any Morphine recording. He wouldn't let me. I mean, this was one of these moments where I think he was in the kitchen stirring up something to eat, and Billy and I were just sort of just plunking away as we often would, and came up with this little groove. And he said, "Oh," he ran over and hit record. So it's like it wasn't something that I was called on to do very often or ever.
How much have you gotten to explore that since?
In terms of guitar,
Yeah.
you know, my own recordings and stuff like that, and just the love of it. I just for me, it's just kind of enjoyable to pick it up and sit in front of a fire and just at the end of a day and just kind of strum through some chords. And it's mostly just for my own meditation at this point.
You mentioned how when the band took off, it was like it was like sustaining you basically. And I know that you did Orchestra Morphine right after. I know you've done some producing. I know Twineman and Vapors of Morphine. You've been active, but how much of an adjustment was that? How much did you have to then rethink to make ends meet basically once things came to a close there?
Well, yeah, it was it was an adjustment for sure, but the thing is, during the period of time when we were making money and playing, it was one of those things where you kind of are pinching yourself. Okay, okay, I don't have to do another job, I don't have to supplement music with painting houses or doing construction. This is a great period. Let's see how long this lasts. I think there was always in the back of my mind that nothing lasts forever, and you're always going to have to find a way to make money. And so yeah, when that when it stopped, you just go back to your life. You go back to what you always did. My wife and I started a family. This was in 2001. My daughter was born. She's now 22. My son was born in 2006. He's 17. So you go back to your life and you take that experience with you, and you start over, And so I did the same, I went back to painting houses and then construction and bike messengering and, doing all of that for years and years and years while still playing music, just like I've always did prior to that. And that's just life. That you accept that. It's like, okay, you got to pay the bills, so you find a way to do it. And currently I'm working. I've got a job now working pretty much 4 days a week as a psychiatric technician, working with treatment-resistant depression, administering transcranial magnetic stimulation, which I was trained in doing, and working with patients who were taking ketamine for depression, sitting with them and kind of being in the room and offering support and that sort of thing. So that's been a great opportunity for me to do something other than, construction. So, and that's where we are today. And, there's no end in sight. Let's keep going.
I've never heard that term, transcranial. So through the head, obviously.
Yeah. It's a magnetic stimulation that simulates neural firing, so that they've been able to determine there are areas of the brain that are less active for people who are suffering with depression. And this method simulates neurons firing so that it is directed to that portion of the brain, a sub-region beneath the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it stimulates neural activity and potentially neuroplasticity. And being able to, they find that by creating energy in this portion of the brain, that it will reduce, in some cases, produce remission in patients with depression. Right. It has a pretty good success rate. It's pretty interesting stuff.
And what is in the pipeline for you musically currently? I mean, even just looking at your room, it's the background.
Don't look too close. Yeah, no, it's a bit of a mess up here. But I'm working, recording with a friend of mine, Chris Harford. We're doing some dub music. We've got about 20 tracks that we're working on. A few more left to do. We have this walking tour that's coming up in September 24th here in Cambridge, where Sabine and Ryan Walsh are leading a tour that will taking a select few of people that have bought a ticket to go up and see High and Dry, the studio space where Mark lived, which is now an architectural firm. But they're going to go up and have a look around and see the space, and then tour some aspects of Cambridge where, some points of interest, all kind of culminating at the Middle East restaurant where we sort of our home court, where Vapors and Morphine are going to play. We're doing a lunchtime show at that point, and folks are invited to come. There's two tiers of tickets. There's a French fries with pepper ticket, we're calling it, for fans who want to come early, and there's FaceTime with the band and kind of see the sound checking process. And then there's the actual show ticket. The walking tour is sold out, but there's still tickets available for the show and for the VIP FaceTime thing. And there's also a celebration of the 30th anniversary of Cure for Pain, and these vinyl releases are sort of all culminating at the same time. So we're kind of doing this thing just to kind of kick that off. And Vapors are looking at doing some touring. Hopefully we're looking at booking opportunities and talking with different booking agents. And we've done a lot of touring in the past. We've been to Russia, we've been to Brazil, we've been to South America and Europe, and trying to find ways to kind of just further that along as much as we can. I just was recently out at Rancho de la Luna working with Dave Catching on the 30th anniversary of Rancho de la Luna. They're putting out a double-sided LP to celebrate that 30 years of Rancho de la Luna, which was like a bucket list thing for me. So, just trying to stay busy. I have my studio here where I can work at home, and some folks send me tracks that they want me to play on, and I get to record here and send them out, and so it's you're just trying to stay creative and follow opportunities where they lead.
And so how much are you looking to produce people still? Like, well, like where is that with you?
Well, no, for some weird reason, I've never really been asked to produce too many projects. I just don't get too many requests, and it seems like a lot of these days that concept of like going into a studio with a band and producing a record is, I don't know how many people are actually doing it that way. It seems like so many bands that have their home studios and just kind of do their thing and self-produce a lot of it. I mean, a lot of people I'm working with are locals and singer-songwriters and different people who just drop me a line on Facebook or something and say, hey, can you record in the song? And I usually say yes. As rarely do I say no. And so I produce my own stuff essentially, and produce my own recordings that would accompany what they've already done in the studio. The idea of going into a studio with a band and working with them from the ground up, that's a lot of work and huge commitment. And there aren't a lot of bands who can really afford to do that. I think, for me to do that, I would obviously need to be paid, and I would have to be, I would have to arrange it with my work and stuff. So I don't really have that kind of flexibility to commit to because you really need to get in there and you really have to be there 24/7 to produce, and I'm just really not set up in that regard right now. Not
Yeah. Yeah,
So.
no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, I think there are people who do things in their carriage house or something,
Right.
and you could do pre-production and do sessions with a band in that kind of setting, but it would still have to be, it would still be involved enough where it would have to be worth your while to take you away from work.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, if I could do that only and that would be it, I'd be quite happy to do it. I mean, but it's at this point in time that, it just isn't really realistic.
Last question for you. You've touched on this a little bit. There is a carefree, even though Cure for Pain has this elegance, and Paul talked about this in the documentary. I believe it was Paul, or maybe it might have been Sean. That there's a carefree element to how that record was made, and even the track sequence, certainly on Yes, it's even more so. I would say there's a certain like looseness to the way everything unfolds. That contrasts with Like Swimming and The Night, which are much more guided and focused as far as how they go along. I wonder, in the documentary, what it's either Paul or Sean talks about how something was maybe lost in you guys made this record and were able to sort of do it without, just do it on your own terms, and there was a sense of freedom there. It sounds to me like, from the way you've been talking, like maybe you feel the band experienced the best of both worlds to some degree.
In what way? Sorry.
Well, just like making records in this sort of loose, no pressure, playing with house money kind of atmosphere, versus now there's expectations, and now we're trying to do something really. Now we have a grand plan.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether the band didn't get the best of both of those types of situations.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say, because I think, like, for Cure for Pain, we had the songs were done, we had them, we were touring on with them. By the time we were in the studio, we had been playing them out a lot, so it was easier just to go, it's there. They are. There's the songs. We've been playing them. Whereas The Night, we were creating and recording and conceptualizing at the same time. It wasn't like they hadn't been tried out on the road. None of these songs had been played on stage. So we were really creating from the ground up, and hadn't even conceived of how we were going to do it live at that point. So Cure for Pain, especially was quite the opposite. We had a live approach that we brought to the studio, which made it very streamlined. So you have your basic song, and then you can say, oh, well, these need overdubs or that needs overdubs. And it's very, very concise and clear, because it's been all laid out. And with the night, it wasn't like that. It was just like, okay, we have an idea, we've got a riff, we've got a concept, we have a lyric, and let's plug them into anywhere they will fit, and then see what sticks, And it was the process of creating, composing, and recording were all happening simultaneously in the studio, and through the course of a couple different attempts as well. So, a different approach. And I guess, a best of both worlds. I just think you are where you are at the time. This is where we're at, and we don't have the songs. They haven't been created. We're trying to create and write and record all at the same time, and using the recording as a compositional tool. So it was a process of chasing it down, more so, I think, in the latter two.
Actually, you know what I forgot to ask you? And then I'll let you go. Thanks for going extra, by the way. I was thinking, I don't know how we're going to do this in 45 minutes, which is why I jumped right in there at the beginning, because sometimes I get the hook from people, it's like...
Today's my day off, so just hanging.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you spending your morning talking this over. Talk me through your introduction and your earliest, the forming of a relationship with the saxophone, and where you were, where the guitar was in your life at that point too. What were you listening to? You mentioned wanting to do this in a rock context. You mentioned Rahsaan Roland Kirk. I'm curious as to how did this start for you? Can you take us back to that?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be exposed to music really early on. My childhood friend, name is Dave Bloss, came from a family of 7 kids, and his single mom, bringing up 7 kids, Edna Howland, his mom, was an amazing woman who loved music, had a house full of music instruments. And my earliest memory is being in her house and just being fascinated by what she had as this color note organ that had, the keys had colors on them that corresponded with music. So it would teach you how to play the song by looking at the notes and seeing what the color was on the keyboard. And just being fascinated by this, being able to touch this button and produce a sound. My earliest memory is being just completely engrossed in the idea of creating sound, and whatever could do that. And she had guitars that she'd just leave out on the couch, and I would go down to visit, and my friend wouldn't even be there. He'd be off doing something else, and I just walk in the door. She was always open, plunk down on the couch, pick up a guitar, and just play the high E string, like ding 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 ding, with one finger. Ding. I didn't know chords, I didn't know anything, but I was just fascinated with this instrument, playing it all the way up, ding 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 ding, over and over and over again. And she would be in there cooking or doing her thing, and never phased, never like, will you stop that? You're driving me crazy. Never. She just encouraged me and was like, Dan has an ear for music. You should get him into music. And then kind of fast forwarding a little bit to our public school had a music program that offered musical instruments to everybody who wanted to try it. And my next door neighbor played the clarinet, and I thought, okay, that sounds like a good instrument. Let me try that. How does that work? No, okay, let's try this. So I played clarinet for a little while. And then the 7th grade, I was in 7th grade, and the high school band came to visit and did a performance, and they played the Pink Panther, the theme from the Pink Panther, and the saxophone player did the solo, in the middle of that. Dun-dun, 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 and I was like, wow, okay, how do I want to make that sound? And it's an easy transition from clarinet to saxophone. So I switched over to sax and started playing that in high school, played in the jazz band, played, kind of half-heartedly. It wasn't like I was driven, to study and to work on it. I was just sort of could play it, and I played it and had fun with it. And when high school was over, with 70s, so we're listening to guitar, we're listening to, Jimi Hendrix was huge. And in my life, it was like, holy mackerel, how do you produce a sound like that? The sound that was coming out of Hendrix's guitar was completely linked to this fire, this emotion that was coming from within this human being. And when you saw him play, and his movement and his dancing and everything just seemed to be so completely in sync with this amazing other, whatever that was. It was a mysterious thing that I just latched onto. I was like, how do I get to a place where I can experience that feeling? And it was just a drive to express, to find a way to express myself. And the saxophone just became the vehicle. So going into early 80s, I went to college at Boston, and it's a pretty fertile period of time for music and creativity and art and all of that. And people, doing your own thing, creating your own bands, creating your own projects. There's crossover from punk was going to new wave, and just this confluence of influences, and they were all kind of converging at the same time. And it just was an opportunity that, here, go do your own thing. And I was at art school. I met a friend who had a band. His band was called Three Colors, and they came and played at a party and invited me up to play. And I'd never played in a band before, never liked that kind of thing, where it wasn't music in front of me. But I had a pretty good ear, and I could kind of figure out what was happening, and just did this kind of abstract James Chance thing. And I was sold. I was like, I want it. Just the camaraderie, the sense of belonging, being in a band was something that I really, really wanted to experience. And from that point on, I just started to think about how I could bring my horn into a setting where I could be involved in this concept of being in a band. And I ended up joining Three Colors, and learned a lot from just being around those guys and watching them record and watching them write, and the simplicity of like a 3-chord song, and watching them and figuring out, okay, I'm learning how to play chords. I want to learn how to play chords. I taught myself how to play chords like guitar. And but always having the saxophone is the instrument that was my strongest. So the idea of like integrating that into contemporary music and the music that we were playing and listening to was kind of just something I just was obsessed with, finding a way to do that. And whatever example I could find that would, like Steve Berlin, for example, was kind of, like I said, okay, it can be done. And then Sandman, Three Colors broke up, and Treat It Right was on the verge of breaking up and hadn't quite done it yet, but they were having some hard times as a band. And Mark and I had met at a show with the Rat, and he invited me to come by his house and jam. And he had us working a 1-string, and I just got my baritone. And it was just one of these things. It was like eureka, when he started playing and I started playing, it just, the sounds just came together. And when he sang on top of it, it became this like triad. He said, okay, let's get a drummer. We got Jerome. And we just kind of created this thing where the sax is going to be integral and as a part of a foundational aspect of a rock band. Sandman saw the potential, whereas I was just looking for any opportunity to play with anybody. So
right. And so that first horn, like, was that a Barry or a tenor?
Tenor was my first. Yeah, still is. I still have my same one. Yeah.
So that solo in the Pink Panther was done by somebody playing
tenor. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell because it's so deep, right? Like the main but is the main figure. Okay, that definitely, and I mean, where does the Barry come in? Like, who are you hearing besides?
Okay, good. That's a good question. So this is a time in the 80s where you have people like Michael Brecker and David Sanborn who are going into the stratosphere, right? They're going up, and every saxophone solo you hear has got this, like high end, they call the altissimo range, which is essentially a part of the instrument that doesn't have keys on it. It's just like, it doesn't really exist in terms of keys. It's all about alternate fingerings and blowing a certain way that, brings it up. And it's you hear it, it's like this crowd pleasing sound. It's just like, holy mackerel. So everyone was going up, and I figured, well, I'll go down. So that was essentially why the baritone was chosen from my perspective. And I went down to 54th Street. My dad gave me $1,100, and I was going to buy a horn. And I went into I think Woodwind and Brasswind on 54th Street or 45th Street. I forget where it was. This big music row down there, and there was a baritone on the wall. And I said, "Can I try that?" And there was a mouthpiece in the case. I said, "Okay, I'll try that. Give me a read." Popped it on there. There was a couple of notes that worked. The rest needed work, and I could tell just by the few notes that worked that the horn had something, had some resonance to it. And so I gave the guy $1,100 and walked home with my baritone, which I still have today. And it's a Conn 12M 1930 vintage, roll tone holes. It's Lady on the Bell, which is like they engraved this naked lady on the bell of the horn in those days to signify what the value of the horn in terms of the maker. If they really liked the horn, they would show full bosoms with nipples and everything. If they were somewhat, not that impressed with it, they would it would be less. And mine looks like a strange abstract Picasso. It doesn't even look like a lady. So I don't know what they thought of this horn, but I ended up liking it, and it became my horn.
And the same one we've heard.
Yep, the same. Yep.
Yeah, I think the store. So you're talking about New York.
Yeah.
So I think the music store area is in the 40s.
Okay. So yeah, 40th Street.
I know 48th Street has all those guitar shops. I don't know about horns, but
that sounds right.
Probably in that same.
Yeah.
There's a famous place, 48th Street Custom Guitars. Wow, that's almost like a fighter planes that are decorated with like ladies on the side.
Yeah. Same era, I would imagine.
So it doesn't sound like you were hearing much like that. It sounds like everybody else you felt was going in the opposite direction, almost like the falsetto of saxophone. Almost.
Exactly. Precisely. Yeah. Yeah.
And altissimo, highest, right? Mm-hmm. Like, now after starting to play, how much did you discover other people doing interesting things? I know Mark liked really sort of bare bones. He had a thing for like old recordings that were very stripped down, mm-hmm. right? Like how much did you go back and discover in jazz or anybody doing anything on the Barry, and also how much did Mark introduce you to musically?
Oh, Mark introduced me to an enormous amount of music. He was constantly, scouring the record bins for obscure tracks, and you open up my eyes to a lot of ears to like a lot of African music and Ethiopian music and stuff like that. And you hear, the more you listen, the more you hear it. Like it's not that unusual. The baritone is featured in a lot of different stuff, especially like Ethiopian big band stuff, and it's out there quite a lot. For me, I've always loved jazz. I've always listened to jazz, so jazz has always been for me like the Rosetta Stone of the saxophone. It's where the language has been perfected, and so when you're listening to Jerry Mulligan or Pepper Adams, that kind, just you hear just the instrument in its most fluent and proficient manner, and you hear everything that the instrument can do. And so it's always a touchstone, in terms of where you can go with this. And so since then, I've always been, I've been constantly trying to perfect and work and practice and do scales and learn more about it, because I don't really have a jazz background, but for me, that is something I'm really interested in and study, and it will never, ever, fully master it for sure. There's no way. It's just not possible for me anyway. It's like I don't have those chops. I don't have the jazz background, but I'm more of a blues approach, more of a rock approach, which is very simplistic in comparison when you think about bebop and that sort of thing. But it practice, and then forget practicing. And then when it comes time to play, don't stop practicing. It's like you practice, you push yourself beyond your limitations in hopes that some of that you'll retain in terms of bringing it to your own music,
and be able to call on it on your toes without thinking. It's spontaneously.
Well, yeah, just to get better command of your instrument and to understand the relationships of the notes. It's to force yourself to do things that go against your habits. To go against what your inclination would be habitually, and to force yourself to try exercises that are difficult and foreign to your ear, or foreign to what is comfortable. Pushing yourself out of that comfort zone is kind of what I try to do in my practice regime. But when it comes to playing, it's like I just let what happens happen.
So it sounds like this is still very much a practice.
Always,
this is part of your
every day, and I wish every day, in my mind every day. But unfortunately, I don't have as much time to do it as much as I would like to. But as much time as I can devote to it, it's key just in terms of keeping your relationship with the instrument. It's as intimate as possible.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it is an everyday. It's an everyday thing as far as your heart and your consciousness.
Yeah.
If not always having the time every day, but that it's very much a presence.
Yes.
Everyday presence for you.
Absolutely.
And an aspiration. You said you love jazz. So it sounds like where in your listening did that come? You said as a kid you were listening to rock in the 70s, but where does jazz come in for you as a listener?
Well, my dad had quite an extensive collection, and I have them now, and he loves music. He's been a huge supporter, and so I've listened to his records early on. My grandfather's records, I have my uncle's records. Jazz is music has always been played in our house. My dad's a huge lover of opera and classical and jazz, and my parents met at dancing at big band events in Portland, Maine, and so music has always been an important part of my parents' life, my father especially. So he would always bring, once I started playing clarinet, he'd say, "Oh, listen to Benny Goodman." And we'd go, he took me to see Benny Goodman. And so, I got a lot of opportunities to hear, because there was always music in the house.
Yeah, I mean.
So, and as a saxophone player, that's where you're really going to hear the best of the best.
Sure. But even so the Barry, like in terms of, I guess, what's most recognized on a mass level, you mentioned Jerry Mulligan, but I mean, I think the average person, other than like a real deep aficionado, when they think of jazz, they're not going to think of the Barry first,
right,
with saxophone. And, you talked about not having jazz chops, coming more from a rock and blues approach to the Barry. I think what that's done is given people an opportunity to understand that this isn't just, yes, it's a bass register instrument, but there's more to it in terms of the body of the sound that it occupies, the body of sound that it has in a piece of music. It's not just low. Right. There's more harmony that's available with a Barry specifically. I'm not talking about doing both horns at once, but there's a harmonic presence that I think people, what you've done has given people an avenue to hearing that there's a texture, there's a tactile element to the Barry that maybe a lot of us wouldn't have understood. We just would have assumed, it's a bass instrument, or it's the low horn on jazz records, right?
Yeah, I know it's an interesting instrument. It has its it certainly has its role in jazz, but there are certain players who have branched out of there, and taken it into it, and it just not just to be a low end part of the horn section, but have featured it as a soloist instrument, and it's kind of marvelous to hear that, because it can be a clunky instrument, and to hear it played with fluidity and expertise, it's knowing what it takes to get those sounds. It's always kind of inspiring, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier, you played the sax in place of the guitar. I never saw it that way I never heard it that way in Morphine. To me, it's almost like the voice. It's like at times it is the lead vocal, at times in that same space. Obviously, Mark was singing lead vocal, but there are times like the beginning of Super Sex and other tunes where it's like it is singing.
Yeah, no,
you know what I mean?
Sax is like the most and the closest instrument there is to the human voice in many ways, in terms of its voicings. Obviously, it's the voice is like the voice is here, and then everything else is here, because we all have a voice, so we relate to that. In terms of music, when we hear a song, why is it why is vocals that songs with vocals are more interesting to most people than instrumental music, because it's how they relate to music. It's like, oh, I have a voice, I'm hearing a voice, I relate to that. Now, if you're a bass player, you might relate to a bass, but everybody has a voice. So in that way, yeah, the instrument has that capacity to kind of branch across and reach across as a vocal, as similarly as a vocal would do.
Yeah, and I mean, Morphine brought the Barry into pop culture in a way that it would not have been otherwise.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, I'll buy that.
I mean, it just wouldn't. I mean, undoubtedly somebody would have eventually done it, but it's like there is now, however, I don't want to say modest, but on whatever scale, to whatever scale it was done, there is now, even if somebody's just watching Get Shorty or something, they might not even know, but it's there.
No. Right. True. Yeah.
In a way that it.
Yeah. No. And I think that's probably true for your average consumer, that there isn't, they don't understand what they're really listening to, and they don't really need to. They don't have to. It just comes at you, and they accept it or they don't.
One
I
of the
have
things
to go. I'm afraid. I have another interview.
Listen, thanks for going extra.
My pleasure. And if there's any questions you have, that you think of that you forgot or something, please feel free to email me. Or
I should be okay, but if there's any fact checks, I'll write to Aaron. But yeah, thanks a lot. Real pleasure talking.
You have my email. You can just write to me directly if you need.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I'll do that if fact checks. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good morning.
It's been a great pleasure talking with you, Sabi.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.